He rode a blazing saddle, he wore a shiny.
And welcome back, everybody. Jason Lewis Live, up and running for a Thursday on Patriot.tv, the new network for the news you can trust. Oh, I love that moniker. I love that moniker. And I like it almost as much as I love our brand new, he doesn't know it yet, but he is now officially our brand new resident, highly paid network economist. Dr. John Lott joins us for the first time of many on Jason Lewis Live. Dr. Lott, welcome. The check is in the mail.
Okay. I'm waiting for it. I have a few things I could spend it on, but thanks for having me on.
Have I ever misled you before?
I'm still waiting for the check, but as you say, who can trust the post office? So,
Exactly, sir. Exactly. Everybody knows Dr. John Lott, author of More Guns, Less Crime, but that's not all. He was on the U.S. Sentencing Commission. He got his Ph.D., of course, from UCLA. He now runs as the president of Crime Prevention Research Center, and he's been a stalwart defender of people's, not the Second Amendment right, the inherent right of self-defense in a free society. And that's really what the Second Amendment is that's the enforcing constitutional amendment of an inherent natural right to defend yourself. For heaven's sakes, even in the law, self-defense is a defense, but philosophically, it's been there since the time of Western civilization, and yet it's under attack like no other, John. Before we get to that, and especially this bump stock case that the justices heard yesterday, I do want to touch once more on the inflation numbers, because once again, it doesn't matter, who's delivering the news. The media can't help themselves. The news out of Reuters today: U.S. prices accelerated in January, but the annual increase in inflation was the smallest in 3 years. It was the smallest, quote, year-on-year increase since February 2021. And there you can see the graph that shows that wonderful inflation number dropping down. Now, of course, it's dropped somewhat from when the COVID hangover from shutting the economy down and paying people not to work and not producing any goods and services. But what has happened, and I want you to explain this to people, is there's been a sort of wink and a nod media recalculation of how we monitor inflation compared to the old Jimmy Carter days.
yeah, well, even well after Jimmy Carter, up until a decade or so ago, what would happen is that you'd have the monthly numbers out, and then they would go and essentially multiply that by 12 in order to get the annual rate that represents, because otherwise it'd be harder for people to understand. Sometime
So if you had, if you had a 0.4 core index without energy and inflation, or including energy and cost of goods and other groceries and things, if that went up 0.4 in the month of January, the way we used to do it, you and me when we were kids and through adults, like you say, 10 years ago, you'd multiply that 0.4 times 12, and during the month of January, at that rate, going forward, inflation was rising almost 5%.
Exactly, it'd be 4.8. That's exactly right. And so,
but now what do they do?
Well, kind of at the beginning of the Biden presidency, when inflation was rising very quickly, they decided to go and look at the numbers over the preceding year. And by doing that, they made it so that at least for a while, the inflation under Biden didn't seem too bad, because during the Trump administration, it was less than 2%. And even, it took a few months of Biden's policies before inflation started to increase. It wasn't really until the end of the summer of 2021 that you started to see an increase. So they may see large increases, in September, October, November 2021, but it didn't really look that large because they had all these other previous months where it was very low. The irony is that that may have got them through for a while, but given how high it was. So, for example, they would say that the inflation rate was over 9%, but a lot of that included very low earlier months. If they had done it on an annualized rate from the highest months that were there, it would have been like 12% or so. And so
Well, not just the
And
annualized rate from the highest month, the annualized rate from the last month they took.
yeah, right, exactly. And so now, of course, we've have an increase in the rate. So if they had just compared the last month versus the month before that, January versus December, they say, uh-oh, inflation at an annualized rate has gone up. But since they're including all these other months that are there, it kind of hides it because it's gone up now, but you're dropping
Right.
out earlier months from a year ago that were even higher.
Right. Yeah, like you say, initially it included the Trump years, which made the rising inflation seem lower. But then it's sort of a reverse effect. When inflation was finally starting to drop, you could say it was actually including those good years. But now if it rises again, it benefits them to do it again and include those lower months. And I just think that is so deceitful on the part of the press. Now, to be fair, it's not a government recalculation. The government, and they've got plenty of problems with the way they calculate inflation with a fixed basket and the substitution effect and all that. But it's just, how did this happen where they decided to literally switch on how they're reporting it, I guess?
I am sure we could have a long discussion about media bias in many different ways, but obviously this was one way that the media, you can't get into their minds. It seems kind of hard to believe that it wasn't intentional, but even if it wasn't intentional, the bottom line is what effect it has on people's perception about how inflation is changing.
And then the net effect is inflation is much higher than they're telling us, in my view, and I think it's going to continue that way. Now, you have done so much good work with regard to Second Amendment rights, or as I like to say, the right to self-defense. And of course, your work coincides with, as Clarence Thomas finally said, acknowledging at the federal level, the Supreme Court level, that the Second Amendment is not an orphan amendment, that under Heller and McDonald and other cases, that there is an inherent right, individual right, to bear arms. So now we're left with what's an arm, I guess, or what does that constitute? And yesterday, the Supreme Court heard this case over bump stocks, over whether that constitutes a different function, who should decide what the function is, and where it's going forward. Now, it came out of the Las Vegas tragedy, of course, but it's sort of been back there simmering for a while. Why don't you explain that to our listeners and viewers?
Right. Well, there's traditionally been three different types of weapons, and it's been very clearly defined. Various administrations in the past have defined it. You have manually loaded guns, where after you fire a round, you have to physically yourself put another round in the chamber. There's semi-automatic guns. One pull of the trigger, one bullet comes out. The gun reloads itself. One pull of the trigger, one bullet comes out, and so on. And then you have fully automatic or machine guns, which as long as you have the trigger depressed, you have a very different firing mechanism there that the bullets will continue to come out as long as there are bullets in the magazine that you have. And, there's really never been any...
They've been effectively banned since the 30s with attending legislation also in the 60s that took those out of the hands of the public. So the question in front of the court is whether the bump stock apparatus turns those semi-automatics into a machine gun, as it's defined statutorily, correct?
Well, machine guns actually haven't been banned. They've been limited. There are 250,000 since 1986. It's limited the number of machine guns in the United States to 250,000. That was the number that was there. Essentially, at that point, you have to have, from the 30s on, you have to have a stick, what they call a stamp, that gets put on the side of the weapon there, and you have to pay a fee in order to get it. And they limited in 1986 the number of those stamps. The thing is, there's no crimes that are committed with machine guns in the United States. Since the 1930s, there's been one murder that's involved a machine gun.
And by the way, when I say, hold on, John. When I say ban, I mean de facto ban by what you just described. If you look in the 30s, and then there was some legislation in the 60s, and then 86, it made it very, very difficult for the average citizen to get a machine gun, an automatic firing machine gun.
Because they are limited. you're talking about $15,000 or $18,000 to get a gun that doesn't even work, just to be able to get that stamp on the side of the gun. To get one that works, the most basic one, you're talking about something in the $20,000 range that's there. Those
Right.
prices went up dramatically after 1986. They weren't anything like that beforehand. But whether before or after 1986, you just haven't seen crimes being committed with these types of guns. So the bump stock essentially is something that allows the gun to rock back and forth, where you can have a semi-automatic gun. You still one pull of the trigger, one bullet comes out. But by rocking the gun back and forth on your shoulder, which, by the way, makes it almost impossible to carefully aim the gun, they can speed up the rate of fire. It's still nowhere near the rate of fire of a machine gun. And by the way, just so people know, it's never been clear. There's never been evidence that, in fact, the guns that were fired in Las Vegas used a bump stock. There were bump stocks on the guy, I don't know, had like 18 guns or something like that there in his room. And a couple of the guns did have bump stocks on them, but it's not obvious that those were the guns that were fired. The guns that were fired, it appears, did not have the bump stocks on them. So I know they want to kind of link that in on it, but it's even that part's not clear. But the thing is, because it increases the rate of fire that you can have, there was a push during the Trump administration to redefine what a machine gun was, essentially. And one could go and argue.
John, hold that thought. John, I'm going to keep you over for one more segment. Hold that thought so you can go right into that and explain the controversy at hand. We'll take a quick break and then come back more with Dr. John Lott. He's the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center on Patriot.tv.
He rode a blazing saddle, he wore a shiny. He rode a blazing saddle, he wore a shiny.
Continuing now with Dr. John Lott, my old buddy, economist, and great defender of the Second Amendment. Of course, you know him for More Guns, Less Crime. He's also the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, and he's joining us on this bump stock case. Now, you were just about to say the real thing, they've got to decide two things, I think, John, and let you finish. But the real thing is, does it function as a machine gun the way you described? And I think there's reason to be skeptical there. And number two is, who shall decide, the members of Congress or the ATF?
Right, exactly. And during the Trump administration, when the Las Vegas shooting occurred, there was a big push in Congress to redefine what a machine gun was, to include explicitly in the language there that it included bump stocks. In the Trump administration, Trump decided that maybe a safer way to do it was to go and do it administratively, have the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms redefine bump stock as being a machine gun. And that's what the case before the Supreme Court is, whether or not Congress is the one that can change the definition of what weapons are banned, or whether you can do that through kind of the executive branch. And I guess,
yeah, as you allude, the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals said the statute's pretty ambiguous on this. You can't just redefine something as a machine gun just because you want it. The statute doesn't cover that. So they went to the administrative state to do it. And this is part of a much broader debate in the country. And this is why I think the Supreme Court is going to strike down Chevron, that we've got laws being created by people who were never elected to create them.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we don't need Congress. We just have the executive branch kind of make up new rules as they go along. You know, they could do these things quickly. One point, since we're talking about the replacements for Mitch McConnell. One of the big disasters that we face right now is, for people who own guns, is the so-called Bipartisan Community Safety Act that was passed under Biden. John Cornyn, the senator from Texas, negotiated that, and it is a mess because they redefined some terms, so what it means to be a gun dealer. And the Biden administration right now are
Right.
using what seem like very innocuous changes in the definition to go and make it in the proposed rules that they have, which are supposedly 1,300 pages. They, at least in the earlier proposed version, they define essentially everybody as a licensed dealer. If I were to sell you one gun and even talk about selling a second gun, I'd be have to be a licensed dealer. If I go and sell a gun and keep a record of how much I paid for it and what I sold it for, I would have to be a licensed dealer, even with just one gun, to make it so that people have to go through the whole regulatory process and pay the fees in order to be able to be listed as a licensed dealer. And, this is at the same time, ironically, that the Biden administration is putting literally thousands of gun dealers out of business under their so-called zero tolerance policy, where you make one paperwork mistake, no matter how trivial, no matter how inconsequential, and they take away your license to be able to be in the business that's there.
Well, that's the danger of the red flag laws. We should probably talk about that a little bit, too. By the way, we'll try to get to calls if we have time this segment. Don't forget, folks, 901-316-8404, 901-316-8404. But, what they try to do administratively during the Obama administration was call, and I'm being a little bit talk radio facetious here, but call somebody crazy and incompetent and unstable if they can't have the trouble, with their checkbook every month and they're a senior citizen, and then taking away their gun rights because of it. I mean, these red flag laws can open up a real Pandora's box, depending on who's defining competency.
Right. Look, we already have laws on the books that if somebody's a danger to themselves or others, you call up the police. The police will evaluate the person. If the police think that there's a, quote, reasonable chance, which is like 20% likelihood that it's true, they take them in for a psychiatric evaluation, and if the experts agree with a reasonable chance, then there's an immediate hearing. If you can't afford a lawyer, one's provided for you, and evidence is cross-examined and determined. And then the judge has a range of options, anything from having you voluntarily go and see an expert and reevaluating after a week or two, to taking away your gun or your driver's license, or in the most extreme case, involuntarily committing you. Every state has had those for many decades. What this does is,
well, look, I mean, you've got states now saying that, look, we're just going to flat out violate the Second Amendment if you believe in incorporation doctrine and the Bill of Rights applying to the states, as that is the standard under which we live. We're going to flat out violate this and by requiring the reporting of every sale, private, legal, dealer, individual to individual, of any gun, manual-fired, semi-automatic gun in the country. I know a number of states that have those laws on, getting ready to pass those laws. How is that not, in the final analysis, just plain and simple, the registration of all firearms?
Well, they are registering all firearms. I mean, the Biden administration, as of about 2 years ago, had put together a computerized database of almost 1 billion transactions of guns over many decades. The reason why they push for these universal background checks, these background checks on all private gun transfers, is they want to make sure it's complete, that they want to have all the recent transactions that are occurring with the, and they claim
right now if you're a federally licensed gun dealer, you have to do the FBI background check, as you have pointed out many times. But if my uncle gives me his old 32 as an heirloom, or just says, hey, you can have it, I don't have to report that. That's not a sale of a gun, and they want that. They want to know, don't they?
Well, they claim that the reason why they want to do this is to solve crimes. The thing is, registration and licensing has nothing to do with solving crimes. We've had many places in the country that have had it for decades, and they can't point to one single crime that they've been able to solve involving the use of a gun. And there's a simple reason for that. In theory, if a criminal leaves a gun at a crime scene and it's registered to the criminal, then you can trace it back to him. The problem is, crime guns are virtually never left at the crime scene. When they are, it's usually because the criminal's been killed or seriously wounded, so you've solved it anyway. And the once or twice beyond that, they're not registered. And the once or twice that they are registered, they're not registered to the person who committed the crime. So You look at a place like
Which
Hawaii, which has
brings,
had
yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Hawaii has had registration licensing since 1960. They can't point to one single crime that they've been able to solve, and yet it takes 50,000 hours worth of police time each year to go and run the registration licensing process. That's 50,000 hours worth of police time that could be spent on things that we know police are very good at for solving crime, and instead are thrown away on things that they can't even point to one single crime that they've been able to solve.
Which brings us back to the bump stocks. And here is the question that, for one reason or another, the media never make the gun control folks answer. If bump stocks are somehow found covered under the ATF regulation or the statute, it's read into the statute, whatever, name me one criminal who's entertaining the idea of getting a bump stock that will abide by it anyway. There will be a black market for that as quick as you can say legalize pot. I mean, it's just so silly to think they can wave a magic wand and say, we're going to take it away from the people who aren't going to use it anyway in a criminal act. And therefore, the bad guys who are already willing to violate the law will abide by it. I mean, seriously, who thinks this way?
But look, you can make a bump stock very easily, essentially with a large rubber band or something. You can go and make it so that the gun will rock back and forth very quickly when you fire it. And the notion that somehow you're going to be able to stop people from getting or making a device like that just isn't serious. All you've done with a lot of these laws, whether it be magazine restrictions, bans on so-called large capacity magazines, or whatever, people, I don't know if they have any knowledge about guns, but I've seen people put together magazines in like 2 minutes, literally with a stamp press. So it's just a box. It will not
solve the problem to the degree there is a problem.
All you've done.
We got to run, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. John Lott, author of More Guns, Less Crime, president of the Crime Prevention Research. It's a great foundation. It's a great group, and I'm glad you're doing it, John. I'm glad you're out there, and we'll have you back many times, I'm sure. Dr. John Lott, everybody.